When Susan Hoffman asked me to introduce Ken Alex to this OLLI lecture, I said, sure. And Ken and I have known each other through CLEE, which is the Center for Law, Environment, actually Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at UC Berkeley Law School. And we have both been on the advisory board for CLEE throughout most of its history. So Ken is currently the director for Project Climate at UC Berkeley's Law Center and for CLEE. And that's a new project that he has initiated. And that purpose of that project is to transform top research into policy. So it's action-oriented policy. Ken spent 8 years from 2011 to 2019 as a senior policy advisor to Governor Jerry Brown and the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and also the chair of the Strategic Growth Council, focusing on climate environment and land use issues. Before joining the Governor's Office, Ken was Senior Assistant Attorney General heading the Environment section of the California Attorney General's Office and the co-head of the office's Global Warming Unit. From 2000 to 2006, he led the California Attorney General's Energy Task Force, which investigated price and supply issues related to California's energy crisis in 2000-2001, AKA the Enron scandal. Ken holds a BA in political theory from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he is a graduate of Harvard Law School. It's over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Mason. Thanks very much. And really appreciate the opportunity to be part of lifelong learning. I'm a big fan and really pleased that we have this opportunity. I will say it's a little bit odd to talk into an iPad, but that's sort of where we are right now. And for those of you in the Bay Area, we're suffering today from part of climate impact, the really fairly brutal air here is back up to unhealthy levels. So this is hopefully a fairly timely topic for all of us. I do want to start, as you can see by the first slide here, I do want to talk about solutions to climate change that we'll get to in a minute. But I wanted to also recognize that we're at this unique moment. And I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and about Black Lives Matter just briefly. Before I do that, I should say we're on until 11:30. And so I'm going to stop at about 11:15 and for questions. And I might, if I can, if people have questions as we go, I might try to work answers in. But as you have questions, if you put them in the chat function, which all of you should have access to, that would be great. And I'll try to get to those, as I say, starting at around 11:15, if not sooner. So at any rate, clearly we're in an odd situation with the pandemic, but there are some lessons to be learned here that connect very directly to climate change. As you can see, the first on my list is to listen to scientists. Sadly, we have to keep repeating that. You know, with yesterday's news that the President of the United States, who doesn't wear a mask, now has COVID, that issue is underscored. And I also think that one of the things that we've learned, hopefully, from COVID is the fragility of our systems. Who would have thought that our food systems, for example, are so susceptible to collapse that very quickly you might not have availability of things like toilet paper. Ecosystems are the same. They can crash, they are fragile, and we can see it occurring in real time. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Perfect, thank you. And so quickly, I also want to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter, because it's, you know, at the top of the news and incredibly important in this country and beyond. And I think it also gives us some interesting lessons related to climate. And really that has to do with resilience and the need to have resilient systems. That is a huge issue in climate change. And we certainly see some of the issues in our forest communities and the lack of resilience. And I do want to underscore the issue of fairness, justice, and opportunity is very important elements of resilience and how we should think about building communities in a resilient fashion as we go forward. And as I note, I think these are important keys to surviving upheaval. So let's go to the next slide and turn to climate change. I suspect this is not an audience that needs to have reinforced that climate change is not a hoax. I think we've reached a different place in how we think about climate change, and I would say California has been here for quite a while. I think the rest of the country now is, for the most part, in a place where there's a recognition without constantly having to say that climate change is human caused. I think we've finally gotten beyond that, and of course the year 2020 has been truly a wake up for those who may not have thought about it much in the past, between hurricanes and heat waves and floods and fires and, you know, the whole parade of horribles. So I think now when the president says that the science doesn't exist or that he says it's a hoax, that those comments are met with ridicule and pretty broadly ignored. So I think we're finally in a different place. And the real issue now is, do we have time enough to act in a way that will make a significant difference and avoid the worst impacts of climate change? Let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to start in a fairly optimistic place, which may surprise some of you. But if you think back about 15 years to around 2005, we were nowhere near where we are today. There was almost no solar energy in California, which is kind of hard to think about or kind of surprising to think about. And that's true in the United States more broadly. Wind was a little bit further along, but even wind energy was fairly modest. We really had no Tesla and no electric vehicles. Batteries and storage were really at a very, very different point. And I've just been reading in the last couple of weeks at how the cost of batteries and the efficiency of batteries is moving along much more quickly than the market had originally anticipated. And I have cell phones down here because, you know, that's the prototypical concept. We all use smartphones, cell phones. It has a penetration of billions around the world, and that occurred in less than 10 years. So there is a real and profound ability to make massive change in the time frame that I think we need to do it. At least there is some amount of progress. California continues to be a leader. Last week, of course, California Governor Newsom announced 2035 as the end of sales of combustion engine autos in the state, which is a pretty dramatic move for what at least used to be the world's largest auto market. We, of course, continue to love our cars in California. And China announced that they would get to carbon neutrality by 2060. That's encouraging because that is a big change for now the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So I have a certain amount of optimism that we can reach the goals and the challenges, but there are very big challenges to get to where we need to go. So what I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on here is this next slide, good anticipation, and talk about, there are different ways to think about how you move forward on climate. This is really laid out the way California has been working towards climate action over the last number of years. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this formulation. There are different ways to think about climate action, but this is, I think, as good as any, and will give you a good sense of the spectrum of issues in action. And then after that, I'll turn to some of the solutions and barriers to solutions that I see. In California, the energy sector and the transportation sector combined is about 70%, is responsible for about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So not surprisingly, a lot of the focus is on those sectors, and a lot of the time and energy spent is around those. So starting with energy, and hopefully some of this will start to sound fairly familiar to many of you, but I think it's worth going through a little bit so we kind of set the baseline. California has been fairly successful on the energy side. It started a number of years ago in the Schwarzenegger administration, actually back to the Davis administration before Schwarzenegger, setting a goal of 20% of the energy coming from renewable sources. Interesting to note, I think, that when that 20% bill was in the legislature, California's main utilities opposed it, saying they couldn't reach it. It passed anyway, and now California has 100% renewable energy requirement by 2045, and the utilities supported that bill. So the world has again changed pretty dramatically and the energy sector is probably the largest place where gains have been made. That 2045 100% is a little bit different than the other goals that were set in California. It went from 20 to 33 to 50. The 100% includes, as part of calculation of renewable energy, it includes both nuclear, which is kind of non-existent in California, or will be when the final major nuclear power plant goes offline in a few years. But it also includes large-scale hydro in the calculus. If you include large-scale hydro now in calculating California's energy from renewables, it's pretty close to 50%. So the state is doing very well on that particular set of actions. The next area, buildings represent a very significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, it overlaps with energy because buildings are a big user of energy. So in a way, it's a bit of a subset. But there are 14 million or so existing buildings, including residences in California. And those we are not doing so well with. We have really progressive building codes for new buildings, and new buildings are much more energy efficient than existing ones. But the existing 14 million or so structures, buildings in the state are a significant challenge, and there's a growing effort to think through and to figure out what kinds of requirements might be necessary as we go forward to retrofit those buildings and to reduce their energy uses. There's a fair amount of effort being put into that, and it's complicated right now by the various budget issues and COVID related problems around funding, because it's an expensive endeavor. But we'll see as time goes on if there are some interesting and worthwhile approaches that are possible. The next sort of pillar here, transportation. I mentioned that Governor Newsom issued an order to get rid of sales of combustion engine vehicles by 2035. That doesn't mean that they can't be on the streets, they just can't be sold after that date. There's a fair amount of work to actually get to that point, but that's a pretty big change, and important given California's role in the world in auto sales. So that's a very big change. Transportation overall, California has not done as well as we would have hoped at this point. That will change dramatically as we move to electrify vehicles, because the energy sector will then tie to the transportation sector. The source of electricity being primarily renewable means that the transportation system, as it becomes electrified, reduces its emissions fairly dramatically and fairly quickly. So there's a fair amount of hope, but we continue to drive hundreds of millions of vehicle miles every year, and that keeps increasing in California. This year will be an anomaly because of COVID, but I expect vehicle miles to start increasing again as soon as we move through the COVID situation. There will be a lot more focus on the transportation sector if we're going to get to our goals. And California does have a fairly aggressive actions that are being taken around trucks and buses and heavier duty vehicles. So they're sort of watch this space, because I think there'll be a lot more in the next few years. The next topic, SLCP, stands for short-lived climate pollutants. This is something that I'm quite interested in, as I will talk about in a few minutes. The primary short-lived climate pollutants are methane, black carbon and hydrofluorocarbons. The hydrofluorocarbons primarily in air conditioning systems of all kinds, and refrigeration as well. These are really important, particularly I would say methane. Methane represents about 25% of what we call forcing, the human element of greenhouse gas emissions and the heat related to that. And their short-lived climate pollutants are particularly of interest because CO2 lasts 100 years or more in the atmosphere. So even if we stop producing CO2 right now, we'll have 100 years of GHGs from what has previously been emitted or more. With short-lived climate pollutants, if we stop emitting them, we reduce emissions, obviously, but they also come out of the atmosphere more quickly and create additional time. So methane, in about 12 to 15 years, if we stopped emitting methane, most of the methane would be out of the atmosphere. And HFCs and black carbon actually are shorter time frames. So you get 2 for 1. And so I've quite focused on short-lived climate pollutants. The state of California is a world leader on this. They have goals to reduce 40 to 50% by 2030 of each of those 3 that I mentioned. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies to do just that. The next topic, which I've listed as NWL, is natural and working lands. This is also very significant and probably less prevalent in people's minds, but unfortunately right now California's natural and working lands, and by that usually talking about forests and agriculture, but also wetlands and open space. California's natural and working lands are a source of emissions rather than a sink, and that has to change if we're going to make progress. The biggest source of emission will not surprise anybody. It is fire, and obviously California is being ravaged. That amount of emission from fires in California is right now overwhelming the climate system and the ability to reduce emissions. So that has to change, and it has to change in a dramatic way. We both need to reduce the source of emissions, fire and forests, certain types of issues with agricultural land, and turn that around, which brings me to the next subtopic, which is carbon sequestration. It turns out that the soils have been depleted of carbon and can become a place to sequester a very substantial amount of carbon. That's particularly true in the agricultural sector and also in the forest sector. But there are many other places where carbon sequestration is possible, including sequestering it in things like cement and concrete. And this is in our effort to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris goal, the goal of the Paris Agreement. That can only be done, I think most people now agree, if there is very significant carbon sequestration. And I would include in carbon sequestration direct air capture. There are now systems that are operating in different places in the world that directly capture carbon from the air, and you can either sequester that or turn it into various types of product, including things like plastics. So this is a very big area for possible climate solutions. And then my final subtopic here is that regardless of what we do on these other topics, we also need to pay attention to resilience. I mentioned that at the top around resilience from communities, and how we adapt to the various unavoidable consequences of climate change. And so we need to build resilience into pretty much everything we do and think about, particularly infrastructure and some of the big projects that we hope to have coming out of our COVID recession. So let's go to the next slide finally. Thank you. There are lots and lots of climate solutions. I've mentioned a few as we've gone through here. And I'll mention a few more just to give you a little bit of a sense of it. And then I want to talk about some of the barriers to getting to the solutions. But one thing to take away, hopefully, from this talk is that the solutions are out there. And one of the things that I've come to see being at UC Berkeley, it's mind-boggling the nature and scope and breadth and types of things just at UC Berkeley that people are working on that are truly amazing. And so one of the big issues for me, and one of the main things that I'm working on, is trying to figure out how we get some of the most promising solutions from the stage that they're in into policy and into scale. But I'll come back to that in a second. I want to walk through a few of these solutions. I've listed 3. I'll mention a few others as well. One of the things that I was working on at the end of the Brown administration with Governor Brown, and that now Governor Newsom in California has taken to the next level, is an effort with some partners, including Bloomberg Philanthropies and a company in Silicon Valley, actually they're in San Francisco, called Planet Labs, and also working with JPL, NASA down in Southern California, building an instrument that JPL really provided the work and the funding for, that can detect, it's an optical instrument that can detect point sources of methane emissions. California used that instrument on an airplane and found the 300 or so largest sources of methane emission. Some of you may be a little surprised that the major sources of methane emission point sources, the biggest source is from animal feeding units, dairies. The next biggest is from landfills, and then the third biggest source is oil and gas operations. That is different in some other jurisdictions, but those are the 3 main sources pretty much everywhere. At any rate, this detection instrument has been miniaturized, and now this consortium that I mentioned is building miniature satellites, literally the size of a bread box, and is got a fair amount of funding to get a constellation of satellites that will allow detection of the main point sources of emission around the world, so that every jurisdiction in the world will then have information about point sources of methane. Point sources, as opposed to more disparate sources of methane, represents something like 20% of methane emissions in the world. So if every jurisdiction has that information, they can focus their efforts on reducing those emissions. So I'm very excited about that, and what I'm working on is a series of protocols so that once we have that information, various jurisdictions can then take that information and then follow a protocol for each area. So for oil and gas, they can take that information and then figure out how to reduce those emissions and capture those emissions. Methane, as most of you know, is natural gas, which is a product potentially, and so it has economic value to capture. So I'm quite optimistic that we can make a lot of progress around methane control and capture in the next few years. The next one I want to highlight here, regenerative agriculture, is also one that has a lot of potential. There's, as I mentioned, a recognition that a lot of soils, agricultural soils, have been depleted of carbon and that have a very significant carrying capacity to increase their sequestration of carbon. And so there are a lot of entities, agricultural entities and technology companies looking at different ways to increase what's called regenerative agricultural practices to increase the uptake of carbon in soil. Some of them are very straightforward. There's a lot of evidence showing that having cover crops, for example, if you have an orchard, instead of having soil exposed, if you grow cover crops underneath the trees, that you sequester much more significant amounts of carbon in soil. And it has some added advantages for water retention and also increases yields. So there's very interesting work going on around this and a lot of work to try to figure out how to increase the uptake of these techniques more quickly. I mentioned direct air capture, so I won't talk about that again. I do want to mention a couple of other things quickly. Well, we can, thank you. A couple of other things quickly. One, people don't always realize that about 99% of plastics are made from, right now they're primarily made from natural gas. They tend to be from either from fossil fuels, depending on the price of oil and gas. Right now, natural gas is cheaper. And so most plastic is made from natural gas. It does not have to be. It can be made from captured CO2 or captured carbon, for example. It could be made from plants. At least many plastics can. And so the oil and gas industry, actually, if you look at their projections, they see their biggest growth area over the next couple of decades is plastics. And so that's a place where we have to think very seriously about whether we want to continue to have fossil fuel as the basis for plastics, or if we can change, not only reduce our use of plastics, but change the source. Because we don't really need to do more oil and gas exploration and removal. We can produce plastics and what we need from other sources. And let me mention just one other, and then we'll move on. There's a lot of work around the topic of finance. And so one is simply to have much more disclosure of financial risk. Oil companies have significant risks in the way that we've seen coal companies, that they may strand assets, but they're not very transparent. So there's some effort around figuring out greater transparency. And then on the flip side of that, one of the biggest issues is how do you monetize, how do you create value, monetary value, for doing environmental enhancements? Things like regenerative agriculture, can we create financial incentives for farmers to do regenerative agriculture? And so there's some interesting work being done to think through how we might change incentives in a way that would change our agricultural production. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So here are some of the problems. and you know, I think all of us have a sense of the difficulties when we have a federal government that is really working against taking greater action. And we have corporations that make profits on the fossil economy, and they're very powerful. If we're unable to overcome those things, then, you know, really in some serious trouble. And so, you know, here's a list everybody can take a look at of some of the things that really stop forward motion. And so my view of this is that while these things are sort of on the whole overwhelming, I think if we take various solutions one by one, that there are ways to work through. And so each particular solution has its own set of barriers and its own set of ways through. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Just want to see, yeah. So the methane, for example, in the oil and gas industry, there actually is an interest of excuse me, many oil and gas companies to, sorry, there's an interest in the oil and gas companies to capture the methane because it's product. And that gives us an opening because it allows investment. And it also turns out that there are lots of technologies in the oil and gas industry to capture methane. When you think about methane emissions from landfills and from dairies, it's much more difficult. So with landfills, there are technologies to cap landfills and to capture methane, and California does a pretty good job of that, but it's expensive. And so outside of California and the United States, you can think about how many landfills there are. Every jurisdiction in the world has them, but not every jurisdiction has the technology or the financial ability to proceed. So how do we kind of work through that set of problems? And by the same token, dairies, there are ways, most of the methane is from animal waste, and there are ways to capture that waste. There are things called dairy digesters, but again, getting that technology in place. And then it turns out, like many things that you wouldn't think about, dairy digesters can impact air quality. And so how do you work through air quality issues when you're thinking about also dealing with the methane waste from animals? So that, just to give you a flavor of the types of issues that come up, and that's very different than, you know, the issues that you face in working through something like regenerative agriculture, getting farmers to change some of their techniques, getting them to invest in something with the potential for return that might not come for a couple of years, getting to farmers who tend to be fairly conservative about changing their approach to really embrace something a little bit different. And then you might switch to something like, I mentioned carbon sequestration in cement or concrete. Well, that's cement and concrete are huge sources of greenhouse gas emissions just because of how they're produced. But it turns out that you can also sequester carbon in different ways in cement, and that might be a real way to reduce carbon emissions worldwide. But from a regulatory standpoint, you have to be careful because you don't want to produce a cement or concrete that's going to crumble, and that's going to have bridges and roads and buildings put at risk. So there's a huge need for regulatory certainty, but how do you get to that regulatory certainty in a fashion that is timely? So each of these has its own set of problems and its own set of issues. Next slide, please. So many of you are probably familiar with this quote, but I continue to it's one of my favorites. And so I want to at least leave it with you because I think it is true. And I think it gives us a certain amount of hope that change can occur not only quickly, but efficiently if we keep at it. Let's go to the very last slide. If you want to learn more about what I'm up to and what my project is up to, here are some resources for you. But I see it's about 11:15, so I want to check out and see if we have some questions. Let's see here. Oh boy. I'm on an iPad, so I have to kind of toggle into the chat box. So I'm checking out to see what kinds of questions we might have. Can you provide a carbon balance sheet? What is the fractional distribution of sources of GHG? How much GHG must be sequestered? What is the capacity of each sequestration approach? Yeah, well, that's the answer is that work has been done. And for California, you can go to the scoping plan, which is the roadmap provided by the Air Resources Board. And that balance sheet is broken down in a pretty nice way. I can do some of it off the top of my head, but I'll get it wrong, so I'm gonna limit that. All right. Should public expectation of maintaining unsustainable energy consumption be added to the list of barriers? Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. Yes, absolutely. And those against Prop 15 include ag because they're worried that non-property taxation, the tie enhancements such as carbon sequestration and cover cropping to reduce their taxes. Well, that's an interesting idea. I'm actually working on the incentive side to think through how do we get investment in restoration of degraded areas and promotion of regenerative techniques. I haven't really looked at tax policy much because that, for the most part, is in the Farm Bill and is a federal issue. So probably well worth looking at, and there probably are people who are working on it. Are these initiatives to be taken worldwide? Even if we start local, we need global solutions. Absolutely, that is absolutely the point of what I'm working on in Berkeley. My center is also the home of Governor Brown's California China Climate Institute. I'm an advisor to that, and all the things that we're thinking about, regenerative agriculture, some of the other things that I mentioned, we're trying to find partners in China and are working with provinces in China. So for example, with the methane detection that I mentioned, we're very much looking for partners in provinces in China to identify methane sources and how to control them. With California's, with the Chinese announcement of carbon neutrality by 2060, we're reaching out to Chinese provinces to work in coordination with California's effort. California has a carbon neutrality goal by 2045. And so we're looking for some joint projects with Chinese provinces and with Tsinghua University to really see what might be possible. The Chinese are actually doing some really interesting things, particularly around electric vehicles. They have, there's a city in China that has more electric buses than the rest of the world combined. And they're also working on a technology around fast charging that I'm very interested in, that would require pretty significant change of how the fast charging, how charging systems are done in the US. But I think it has really tremendous potential. Let me see what else we got here. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, I would be more than happy to try to do it that way. We can be multimedia here.
So they're going to have to raise their hand. I have to unmute them.
Oh, okay. So if you want to use the raise your hand function or just wave, we'll see if we can see you. All right, we have George, I see. George Lavender. Can we unmute George?
I guess you can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You're talking about these dates, 2035 for electric vehicles, 2045 for energy neutrality in California. Are these anywhere near close enough to actually, you know, mitigate any of the major effects that are going to happen over the next, 50 years or something, 100 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer is yes. There are those who who think the answer is no, but I think the actual answer is that I think people don't really know. Obviously, the more we can do sooner, the better in many, many ways. But we don't necessarily know tipping points that we cross until after we've crossed them. You might have seen some of the news about the melt in Greenland, which is extremely concerning. And there are many scientists now who believe that we passed that tipping point. So what we can do is what we can do. California is something like the 5th largest economy in the world. It is very difficult to turn a ship of that size. And so having goals that are actually things that the state may be successful, even if they're hard, I think is better than setting a goal that the state will fail. And so I think realistically, it would be great to have set, an electric vehicle or a no combustion vehicle date sooner than 2035. But I think that even 2035 is going to be difficult to meet. And so the trade-off here is one where you push it as far as you can without being so aggressive as to make it impossible. And we have to hope that our ability to sequester carbon gives us some more time. I see, it looks like Gerda has got her hand up. Gerda Ramos, can we unmute her? And then Sylvia after that.
So I can't see people raising their hand. I need to have them use the blue hand so that they'll go to the top of the list so I can unmute them.
Okay.
The blue hand is in your participant window. Click on participants. That window will open in the bottom left. There'll be a little blue hand, because otherwise I have to scroll through the whole list and find you, find your name.
Okay, there's Sylvia. We can take Sylvia first, and then Gerda, if you can find that.
I'm supposed to be on.
Gotcha. Go ahead.
Okay, you quoted Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. So you have looked at it from the top level. Let's go down to the local level. What can one person do in the local level?
Well, the very first thing will not surprise any of you. We have to vote, and we have to have political consequence for people who are not acting on climate change. In the original environment movement in the early 70s, took on the dirty dozen in Congress, and made a very specific political issue about their failure to support environmental laws. And when a number of those, I think 8 of the 12 actually lost their election, the next day every member of Congress was suddenly an environmentalist. We have not had that moment with climate change. Nobody, it has just not been, I think now, according to polling, it's the #1 issue in the Democratic Party, but I really haven't seen evidence of that. It's not talked about in debates. It's not the focus of any election for the most part. And so to me, that's the #1 thing. The second thing is there are efforts, for example, in Marin County, there's something called Drawdown Marin, which is trying to bring the citizens in the county into the discussion very specifically around all of the things that people in the county can do in conjunction with the county to get to carbon neutrality. I think that can be replicated around the country. Many cities are doing many programs that involve citizens and communities. Things like that are very straightforward, like greening inner cities, communities that haven't had trees. California is starting something voluntarism that is going to be under the umbrella of something called the California Climate Corps, that will focus in every community around working on climate goals in the community, and the priorities will be set by the community, but they will all feed into the overall California set of priorities and goals. So, you know, there are probably a lot of other things, but those are the things off the top of my head. Sylvia.
Yes, you spoke about electric vehicles, but is there any concern with air transportation?
Yeah, so very good that you brought that up. Yes, air transportation is a huge issue. The reason I didn't discuss it was because it's primarily, if not exclusively, the federal government's domain. The law is set up so that it is controlled by the federal government, and the state has very little ability to control emissions, air emissions, air airplane, air transportation emissions. So the one thing that I've been looking at and that others have been looking at is that it may be that airports might be able to make certain requirements based on their authority over gates. That's a little bit what's happened with ships. So again, local jurisdictions don't have authority over emissions from boats and ships, but when they come into port, they can have quite a lot of requirements about their emissions. And so by analogy, it may be possible for, say, San Francisco International to make certain requirements for those airplanes that use their terminals. So that may be one way to get at this in the absence of action by the federal government.
Thank you.
All right, well, seeing no other hands up, and we're pretty much at the end of our time, I very much appreciate you guys sticking around, and it was fun to talk, and I'm really sorry we didn't do it in person.
Ken, can you hear me, Ken?
Yeah, yes, I
Nice.
can.
Well, having introduced you, I must say that you really turned me on, and I learned a lot from you at this presentation. So
Cool.
thank you so much on behalf of OLLI.
Well, my great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
I guess we're adjourned.
We are adjourned. Thank you.